They say history is written by the victors, but some stories, they were buried with the victims. Forget ghosts and demons, the real horror lives in the past. And for women, history wasn't just cruel, it was a nightmare. Tonight, we're digging up the punishments, the silenced screams, and the brutal truths that entire cultures tried to erase. If you find this interesting, consider subscribing and liking the video. A small click from you helps keep these stories alive. Story 1. Sati, from India. They treated her like a queen. The morning started early, before the sun had even risen. The women carried bowls of scented water, bathing her carefully, rubbing her skin with fragrant oils. They combed her hair, smoothing it down with coconut and then threading jasmine through the strands. She smelled like flowers, like sandalwood, and she looked like a celebration. Then came the red sari. It was soft and familiar. It was familiar because she had worn it before. She had worn it on her wedding day. Last time she remembered the nervous flutter in her stomach and a weight of something new. A new life, a new home, a new name. But today wasn't about something new. Today was about an ending, because today, she was going to die. Imagine this, you're a girl in India, sometime in the late 1700s. How's your life? Well, it's already decided before you could even say your own name, before you could walk, before you could talk, before you even understood what marriage was. It was already planned out for you. You didn't get to pick who you'd marry. Your father did that for you. All you know is, one day, a man you've never seen before becomes your husband, and that's that. No questions, and you don't have a choice. By the time you're 14, you're probably already a wife, and a few years later, probably a mother. So, that would be the life of an average girl in India. But today, let's talk about one girl in particular. Let's call her Sita. Sita was just a child, a small, bright-eyed girl with hair always tangled from running outside, and her hands always dusty from playing in the dirt. She loved her mother's cooking, always appreciating the smell of ghee sizzling in the pan, and the way her father would lift her onto his shoulders when he came home from the fields. Her world was small but safe, stretching no further than the streets of her village. She had never left, because she never had a reason to. Then, one day, something changed. Her body. The carefree days of childhood started slipping away when her mother whispered to her one morning while pressing a cloth into her hands, telling her she was now a woman. Sita didn't understand what that meant. All she knew was that suddenly she wasn't allowed to run in the fields anymore. She wasn't allowed to sit and joke with the boys. She had to dress differently, sit differently, behave differently. And then, just as she was still getting used to this new, unfamiliar version of herself, she was told something else. She was going to be a wife. She had barely turned 13. The words marriage didn't make sense to her at all. Marriage wasn't for her. It was for grown-ups, for women who knew how to cook and take care of a house, not for girls who still played with wooden dolls and hid behind their mother's sari when strangers came. But it wasn't a question. She had no say in it. Before the wedding, she barely saw the man she was about to marry, just glimpses of him. He was an older man, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s. He had a serious face, and he barely looked at her. They told her he was a merchant. They called him a good match for her. But all they knew about him was he was rich. Before she could even understand what was happening, she was dressed in heavy silks, covered in gold and surrounded by people who laughed and cheered. They kept saying how lucky she was. Then, before she could even process what was happening, the marriage happened, and soon she would be leaving. She was going to have a new home, a new family, a new name, and everything she had ever known was now gone. She had never even stepped beyond the streets of her village before, but now she was being sent away, very far away, with people she barely knew, and no one questioned it. Her parents didn't even think twice, the same parents who had once held her close. The same parents who had never let her wander too far, but now they simply placed her hands in a stranger's and told her to be a good wife, and that was it. She got on the carriage and said goodbye to everything she ever knew. At her husband's home, things were different. The house was big, the walls were high, and the halls were full of people who weren't kind. Her mother-in-law made sure she knew her place. She was no longer a child. She was no longer someone's daughter. She was a wife now, and that meant something very different. She scrubbed floors, cooked meals, washed clothes, and when she didn't do it right, she was told, harshly. Her mother-in-law was a very strict and cruel woman, but her husband, he wasn't cruel, he was quiet. He barely spoke to her, but when he was there, her mother-in-law was less mean to her. But the problem was he was barely home. He was a merchant, so he traveled often, gone for weeks or even months at a time. Sita felt tortured. She cried a lot at the start. She was alone and no one would help her or even treat her like a human, but eventually the tears stopped. She accepted her fate and embraced her new life, because what else could she do? A few years passed. She was 15 now. This strange house had become her home. She hadn't seen her parents since the day they sent her away. No letters, no visits. It was as if she had never existed to them. But at least her husband was kind. At least she had that. And even though he was rarely home, she had started to miss him when he was gone. What began as an escape from her mother-in-law's cruelty had turned into something else. Maybe familiarity, maybe comfort, or maybe even something close to affection. One day, he left on a trip, like always, but this time, he never came back. The news came. People said he had been sick for a few weeks and had, unfortunately, died. And just like that, everything had changed. After hearing the news, Sita just sat in silence. Everything felt heavier for her. Suddenly, there were people moving around her in the house. Relatives, neighbors, and even people she had never seen before filled the house. They wept and cried, filling the house with emotions and chaos. Meanwhile, she just felt lost. Her husband was now dead. She repeated it in her mind, trying to make sense of it. Dead. Just gone forever. But what was she supposed to feel? She was sad, yes, but was she grieving him? Did she even know him? He had been kind to her in a distant way. He wasn't cruel, and he wasn't unkind either. He was just there, like the walls of the house she had lived in since her wedding. Familiar, but not quite close. And now he was gone. Sitting there, alone, made her mind wander back to her happy times, her childhood. It hadn't been that long ago, had it? Just a few years earlier, she had been a girl, running barefoot in her family home, listening to her mother sing while preparing meals, playing with her dad when he was home from the fields. She had been a daughter first before she had been a wife. And now, more than anything, she wanted to be a daughter again. Then she started thinking, this was such a big news, surely her parents would come, right? I mean, someone must have told them by now, and if they knew, why wouldn't they come? Would they arrive by evening? By morning? Would she finally hear her mother's voice and see her father's face? The thought wrapped around her, giving her some comfort. At least she would be able to see her parents again now. And now that she was no longer a wife, maybe she can go back home, to her real home. She barely remembered sleeping that night. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. All she remembered is waking up to the sound of footsteps, loud and harsh. When she opened her eyes, her mother-in-law stood over her with a group of women. Before she could fully grasp what was happening, they pulled her up. There was no time for question. Then, suddenly, everything changed. People that once treated her like a slave were now nicer to her. Hands that had once been rough now moved with unfamiliar gentleness. They gave her a shower, Warm water ran over her skin, fingers threaded through her hair, smoothing it with fragrant oils. Gold bangles slid over her wrists. They then draped her in a red silk sari, the same sari she had worn on her wedding day. She sat, still and silent, as they adorned her like a goddess. She had never been treated this way before, not even as a bride, not even when she had stepped into this house as a new wife. Then she was led outside among the crowd, still dressed like a bride. Confused, she searched for an answer. Her eyes met her mother-in-law's, standing quietly. Gathering what little courage she had, she asked, What's going on?" And the reply to that was brief and firm, "Sati." You see, in India, there was this practice called sati. When a husband died, the widow was expected to follow him, literally. His body would be taken for cremation, and she was meant to go in with him. Some stepped into the flames on their own. Others were pushed. It was said to be an act of love, an act of devotion, a way to prove that she had been a good wife, a faithful one. Some believed it would cleanse her sins, bring her family honor, even ensure that she and her husband would reunite in the next life. But the reality was far darker. In many cases, it wasn't a choice at all. Widows, especially young ones, had little to no place in society. Without their husbands, they were considered burdens, inauspicious, or even blamed for their husband's death. There are records of women being drugged, forced or physically restrained and thrown into the flames. And even when they weren't physically coerced, the emotional and societal pressure on those widows was crushing. Elders, priests, and even other women would tell them it was their duty and that this was the only honorable path. And that, exactly, was where Sita was now. Sitting there, dressed like a bride, surrounded by people who weren't mourning her husband, but they were preparing her. She wasn't just a widow, she was a sacrifice. It didn't matter that she was only 15, it didn't matter that she was still alive, and that she had barely even known the man they expected her to follow into the flames. None of that mattered, because in their eyes, she had no life beyond this. And for the first time since she had heard the news, real fear set in. At that moment, Sita sat there, trying to figure out if she'd misheard what was happening. But as the priest's chant grew louder, the reality settled in. She slowly tried to move just a little to see if she could stand. The instant she moved, someone put their hand on her shoulder, stopping her. She pushed again, using more of her strength this time, but the grip only tightened, forcing her back down. In that moment, she knew the truth. They were getting her ready for a sacrifice, and she did not have a say in it. She began to panic. In that moment, she kept asking herself, where were her parents? If they knew what was happening, surely they'd be here by now. She looked around, hoping to see someone familiar, someone who might come and help, but no one really seemed to care. Everyone just kept looking at the priest and then staring back at her, like she was some form of entertainment or an object. Then, without warning, people lifted her harshly to her feet and pushed her forward. She stumbled forward as she continued scanning the crowd, desperate for any sign of her parents, but the people kept pushing her forward. She started crying, her voice shaking as panic took over. She pulled and kicked, trying everything to break free from the grip that held her down. At just 15, she was too small and weak to fight back. In her desperation, she screamed for help, pleading for someone to come to her rescue, but no one did. They were all watching, but not with concern. No one rushed forward, no one even flinched. To them, this wasn't horror, this wasn't cruelty, it was tradition, something they had seen before, and something they would see again. She kept struggling as they pushed her forward, closer to the fire. She fought with everything she had, twisting and pulling, but their grip never loosened. Then, just as she neared the end of the pathway, she saw them. Her parents. Relief hit her so hard she almost collapsed. They were here. They would stop this. She was safe now. But then she saw their faces. Her mother's hands were clasped together, shaking. Tears ran down her face, but she didn't step forward. She didn't scream for them to stop. She just stood there, helpless, like this was something she had no power over. Her father was worse. He wasn't just crying. He was breaking down. His whole body trembled, his hands gripping his head like he was trying to hold himself together. But still, he didn't move. He didn't reach for her. He didn't fight for her. She stretched her arms toward them, but by now she couldn't even scream. Her throat was raw from crying for help. She lifted her shaking hands. She was desperate, pleading with her face. But then her mother spoke. Her mother's voice cracked, and then she said, "It's tradition. It must be done. Go." Her heart dropped. She turned to her father, the man who used to lift her onto his shoulders when the ground was too hot, the man who had always protected her, always made her feel safe, the man she trusted more than anyone. He was crying, his whole body shaking, his face buried in his hands. But he didn't move. He didn't even look at her. And just like that, she knew he was going to let it happen. Something inside her shattered. The fight drained from her. It was as if her brain shut off. There was no point in struggling anymore. Everyone she knew thought she was better off dead. And so, she let it happen. And just like that, it was over. Just like that, she became another name lost to fire and tradition. She was not the first, and she would not be the last. In 1829, the British banned the practice of sati, making it illegal. But for centuries, this was the reality for widows in India, trapped in a fate they never chose. Although it is illegal now, some say that, in the silence of certain villages, whispers remain that there are still stories of flames that should have died out long ago. What do you think about today's video? While it's not like our typical supernatural story, it sheds light on a real-life horror that, in many ways, is even more chilling. It shows the kind of horror that humans are capable of when they let tradition and fear drive them. If you found this story impactful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Supernatural Secrets for more scary stories from around the world. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and may the mysteries of the supernatural continue to captivate your imagination. This is Supernatural Secrets signing off.